In part one, I made a lawnmower blade knife. The only problem, of course, is that I don't have a handle for it. So in this video, I'm going to show the method that I used, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of what I learned along the way and what, at least for me, what has worked and what doesn't. First of all, I had a scrap of wood that was, it was a hardwood, I believe it was oak, and it came out of like a picture frame or a window frame or something like that. So first I just cut it to a real rough shape, something that more or less fit the handle, fit the parts of the handle that I wanted to be covered with the wood scales. And then I brought it over and cleaned it up a little bit on the belt sander, drew the outline, roughly drew the outline. I didn't want to get too close because I wanted to leave myself a little bit of space to work as I sort of cleaned up the handle a little more. Then brought it back to the scroll saw, and I knew that the grips were way too thick the way they were, so I just wanted to, cut them down enough that I wouldn't have a lot of work to do on the belt sander later. I wanted to make sure not to nick my fingers while I was doing this, and also not to cut things too unevenly to where it wouldn't be fairly easy to straighten it out later with the belt sander. I wanted to have a real nice flat edge to lay against the tang of the knife. So I tried to do this, clean it just a little, but without really affecting the geometry of that factory face. And I rounded things a little bit. I kind of knew that this was going to be contoured. I wasn't going for like this perfectly contoured grip that would fit my hand, but I did want things to be contoured a little. The pins gave me a little trouble for this knife. I thought I had some 1/4 inch. I'm not even sure where it came from, but it was a scrap that was laying around the property. And I've used it for pins on a couple of other things. I've used it for rivets. I have another video how I used this material to replace a rivet in the tongs that I made. But it turned out that once I got the holes drilled and I was ready to fit up the scales, it didn't really work out because it was a little bit larger than a 1/4 inch. So what I decided to do was just to make a run to the hardware store and buy some 1/4 inch round. They didn't have brass, and that was okay. I figured mild steel would be fine. And this part, it's important to get things really, really precise, because when it comes time to run the pins through, I knew I was already going to have the epoxy on there, and that stuff sets up fast, at least the stuff that I got. So I wanted to make sure that everything fit perfectly, that I wasn't trying to make any fine adjustments later. So I really clamped things into place exactly where I wanted them, drilled the holes, and then of course tested the whole thing with the pins. And by this time I had run to get that 1/4 inch material. So it's a little bit of a tight fit, but that's good. You want a tight fit. You don't want things just loosening up on their own while you're trying to get things clamped into place. Then it was time for the epoxy, and as I mentioned before, I had the fast setting stuff, and I didn't realize how fast it sets up. I think it says 6 minutes, but that stuff is almost unworkable after about 4 or 5, at least when you're working in the kind of heat that I was working in. So there I got it all clamped together and set up. Time to take the clamps off. And it actually worked out really well. I think there's one spot where there's kind of a tiny little gap right at the end of one of those scales. And I didn't like that, but for reasons that will become apparent later, it actually isn't going to matter. So next up, I need to clamp it into place and cut off those pins, cut off the excess from those pins. And this can be a little bit rough. It doesn't have to be extremely precise because I am going to peen the ends of those pins, which you'll see in a minute here. And even though they were steel, they actually peened pretty well. It's definitely not like working with brass or copper. But with this, this was probably 1018, so it's a real low carbon steel. So it's pretty soft. Looks pretty good, right? Well, looks pretty ugly, but that's just the stage we're at. Clean that up a little more on the belt sander. So for the next about 60 seconds here, we're going to be on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I wanted to show this. I didn't end up using this material in the final version of the grips for the knife. But I like the way it looked, and I might roll in. I have kind of a glamour shot of the knife. I might roll that in here so you can kind of see it. I felt like it really worked with the whole kind of aesthetic of the knife, having been improvised from a lawnmower blade and whatever, but it didn't make for a good secure grip. So as you'll see here, I ended up peeling that material off and cleaning it up and going back to the hardwood scales, which in the end I'm glad I did. But it was fun to explore, another way to do the grips that if it had worked, it might have been, it would have been pretty cool. I think it would have looked pretty cool. But I'm glad with the way things turned out anyway. So after I peeled those off, I cleaned them up a little bit and sanded by hand to really round those edges. I didn't want to do too much on the belt sander or that type of work. For one, it's hard to kind of get into those little corners and really do the work that I wanted to do. And there you can see there's still a couple little imperfections. But this is really my first knife of this kind. And actually this is the first set of scales I've ever put on a knife. So I was pretty satisfied with the result. If I was making this for like a production run, I'd probably pay a little bit more attention to a couple of little details along the way. But just for a knife that I'm using as a piece to learn on and something that I may use myself, I think this turned out pretty well. Pretty satisfied with it. So here I am just scorching, kind of charring and scorching the scales. The idea there is to give it a darker finish, kind of keep with that grungy feel of the improvised knife. There were some problems with that I'll discuss in a minute. I think if I had it to do over, I would probably take a different approach. My first ever lawnmower blade knife is done, and I can tell you I have learned a lot along the way. Most recently, I just learned if you use flame to char the handle, even just a little bit, if you get it heated up too much, you can wind up with some separation between the scales and the tang of the knife. So things got too hot in there, and that seems to have weakened the bond, or at least near the edges. And it could just be that the wood, just as it dried and heated, it kind of pulled back a little bit from the tang. But that obviously was not intended. So if I was to do it again, I would probably either, probably I would use a more conventional method for finishing the wood. Although, if I was more careful with it, I probably could have pulled this off without damaging that bond. But the scales aren't loose or anything like that. I don't think it's going to affect the utility or the functionality of the knife. But it's it's a cosmetic defect that I'm willing to live with on my first lawnmower blade knife. But on future projects, I will not make that mistake again. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.